And so I came to American University because of Professor Said's class, Spirituality and Global Politics. Oh, this has a timer. I think you could pause it. How do I do that? Aha. Great. Spirituality and global politics. Who puts those things together, I thought? We needed some new thinking, and here was some very new thinking indeed. So I registered as a non-degree student, came down from Philadelphia, and just like that, I was in this far-out class. International relations didn't even acknowledge spirituality as a real thing. How was he going to handle that? Everyone had different spiritual traditions. How would he link them together? It seemed like there was a lot to cover. In came Professor Said the first day and said, "Hello, hello, I'm Professor Said. I'm from Syria. My eyes are red from looking out at the desert sands when I was young. I'm so old, I don't even know how old I am. Really? Ha ha. I don't know. That is who I am. Who are you?" He passed out questionnaires that asked, "Where are you from?" and the like. Then he spent the rest of the class chatting with each of us in turn about our pets and hobbies. I got antsy. There was so much to cover. Why was he spending the whole first class on introductions? Later in the semester, a guest speaker asked, "What is the most important question for peace?" People said, "What do you need? What do you want?" Questions like that. I thought back to those introductions and I ventured, "Who are you?" Said slapped the table and said, "Yes, yes, yes. Who are you? Yes." But what did he mean? Why was "who are you" the most important question for peace? I think I have more of an answer to that now, but to explain, I have to start with human progress and what we think drives it. This was the Great Wall of China. Now it's a big lump. And that's what entropy does. It wears things down into inert lumps. It wears things down into inert lumps. It's the second law of thermodynamics, and everything is going that way. Well, some things are going the other way. The Great Wall got built, but we're still building stuff. I want to look now at how we use negative drivers to explain things going the other way. I first noticed these negative drivers in a book on Melanie Klein. All the psychoanalysts, including her, describe the stages of human growth as full of extreme fear and murderous rage. And moving through them required weathering huge losses in security and identity. It sounded more like trauma than growing pain. They even described these feelings being triggered later, flooding in to overwhelm a completely unrelated situation, which sounds not unlike some aspects of PTSD. But plants and animals don't grow that way. Why would people? Here's my kale patch after repeatedly freezing and thawing this winter. Evidently, kale can take freezing as long as it stays frozen, but repeated freezing and thawing was too much. As you can see, some of it survived, but the strain resulted in a much less productive plant. I'm not going to eat the yellow parts. It's the same in humans. Growing pain is minor pain. Real trauma sucks resources from a healthy life. Whatever it is that lets people recover and grow past trauma doesn't come from the trauma itself. Some traumas never heal and result in limited lives or cycles of abuse, even death. But we do like that idea that pain is productive. It's comforting. It helps us bear all pain. So we consider all pain to be productive and say things like, something good is bound to come of it. Once we claim all pain produces gain, it's only a short step to say that all gain requires pain. This finds popular expression in sayings like, "no pain, no gain," which is bandied about everywhere, even though it's not true. Lots of gain is possible with a little pain. Like building a house. If you're fit, it just requires a few splinters worth of pain, but the benefits are enormous. The loans to pay for the house might be painful, but that's because of our chosen laws about money, not anything inherent in building a house. In reality, enormous gain can be achieved with little or no pain. But we like the idea that our suffering has some benefit, especially when it seems unnecessary. So we assign it pain, even enormous traumatic pain, the productivity it does not have. Just like it says in the ad, we think that if you know pain, you will know gain. We also like to think of antagonism as productive. This became evident to me when I attempted to take a philosophy class. It started with Badiou claiming that the parts work against the whole they constitute. But why would that be so? Parts and wholes create each other. It's a mutually supportive relationship, not an antagonistic one. But all the philosophy these days seems based on assumptions of antagonism. Things contain their own inherent negation. Objects defining themselves in opposition to each other, and all relationships are based on exclusivity, pushing away, and the assumption of antagonism. Saussure said you needed for meaning. Lacan said you needed for thought. Language, identity, everything, even drinking a cup of coffee, requires countless antagonistic operations, according to philosophers. But it's not just philosophers. The belief in antagonism shows up in the overwhelming preference for organizing everything competitively. Schools, work, even basic needs. In humans, competition means both people can't win. It's a fundamentally antagonistic stance. It pits people against each other. In the animal world, many behaviors are described as competition, even though nobody is fighting for a single goal. For example, two chimpanzees eating oranges is described as indirect competition, even if there are plenty of oranges, even if they're cooperating to get the oranges. This is part of why people claim competition is so ubiquitous in the natural world. But in humans, competition means direct competition, which means there are losers. Research overwhelmingly shows that competition is not as productive as cooperation. Fear of failure makes it harder for people to innovate, and the antagonistic stance makes it harder for people to work together. Yet, in the teeth of the evidence, we believe in the effectiveness of competition, possibly because we believe in the necessity of an antagonistic stance. If we believe trauma is essential and productive, and antagonism is essential and productive, it makes sense that we would see war as essential and productive. Many people claim that war is central to human existence, and all those claims depend on two things: that we have an inner animal nature which is violent, and that war has always been part of human social development. But the ubiquity of war is a myth. There are at least 74 cultures currently existing that do not practice warfare, like the Laplanders. Here they are herding reindeer. As you can see, they're not living in primitive conditions. Nor do the historical claims that humans have always waged war hold up. The earliest archaeological evidence of warfare is only 12,000 BC. That adds up to hundreds of thousands of years of human social development without war, and only a few thousand with it. Even the animal nature claim is suspect, with chimps and other primates displaying altruism, reconciliation, and a preference for fairness. If you step back, it's possible to see that believing in the productivity of all these negative drivers, trauma, antagonism, competition, is essentially one broad phenomenon. The consistency with which they don't match reality, but continue to get airtime nonetheless, marks them as elements of a worldview. But if we base our worldview on antagonism, we will remain stuck with recurring cycles of violence. Positive peace is impossible for such a culture. But there are some things antagonism doesn't explain, like cave art. These drawings are 20,000 years old. Human civilization was in its infancy, so we would expect childish art, like we might see if a toddler scribbled on the walls. But instead, we find very advanced art. Look at this third horse. This one here. She's looking what horse people call very marish, which means irritated. The ears are pinned back, ears that are correctly located on the sides of the head, and the far ear, maybe this one, is still, the far ear is receding in space. The skin under the jaw is loose because the mare's head is pulled back and her muzzle is tense. The top line of her nose is curved down because the muzzle is contracted. Her nose is tensed up, as opposed to the relaxed noses of the other horses. Many, many, many carefully observed anatomical details went into conveying this expression, but it's not overdrawn. Keeping the horsiness while getting all the anatomy is just one of the things that make this great art. But where is the antagonism we would expect to find behind it? Society had not stratified. There was no leisure class to support artists. There were no people to work all the time so others could make art. Other seemingly advanced social developments like buildings, wheels, and gardens were all tens of thousands of years away. So where did this sustained creative drive come from? What is creativity anyway? People agree it's the generation of something new, but don't agree on where it comes from. Neuroscientists see it as a neurochemical product. Ancient Greeks saw it as an external spirit. Systems theorists see it as a combination of internal and external factors. One thing we do know is that it seems to be universal, at least in children. All children invent games. Without toys, they make whatever's around into toys, as this kid making a soccer ball out of trash is demonstrating. Another thing we know is that creativity seems to oppose entropy. It represents things getting more complex. If entropy is settling things down into inert lumps of matter, creativity is pushing things up into spiraling towers of complexity. Life itself seems to contradict entropy. I mean, why did the first cells leave the primordial sea? Why develop two cells, millions of cells, bones, mating rituals, dwelling places, cell phones, and all the rest? Natural selection is a method, but it's not a driver. Something is making living things get more complex. And it's not just living things that counteract entropy and get more complex. It happens in non-living physical systems too, like this convection pattern of heat passing through a liquid. Schrödinger posited that there is a physical force that explains this, which we don't know about yet. People are trying to figure out what this law might be. Bejan came up with a very interesting idea of flow dynamics. Because we're always getting energy from the sun, it makes sense that all of the patterns in nature are going to be based on flow. Bejan shows how snowflakes are designed for heat exchange, which explains their beautiful crystalline patterns. Although, I'm not sure I buy his claim that dynamic flow accounts for all the patterns. Surely flow does not require every snowflake to be unique. It's as if there's creativity operating here too. This was a video, but I don't think it'd be anything. Especially when you consider how many snowflakes there are. To recap our list of questions, where did cave art come from? What is creativity? Why did the first cell leave the primordial sea? Why are there so many different snowflakes? Could this all be one thing? The point of this paper is to suggest that yes, it is. We don't need to understand it in order to identify it as the working of one creative force, characterized by the emergence of complexity. Most importantly, we need to recognize that it is this creative force which is responsible for human progress in the face of entropy, and not the antagonism we have been relying on for so long to fill that role. Where Saussure found meaning in difference, without antagonism, meaning is found in relationships. Not only objects, but people, too, can define themselves based on their relationships rather than what sets them apart. Once the expectation the predetermination of antagonism is removed, we can act according to the reality of our interdependence. And if we recognize our interdependence, who are you becomes a whole different question. No longer is it just an assessment tool to figure out what people need so you can design an intervention for them. Who are you becomes a gateway to a real relationship. And if Professor Said is right, it is these relationships that are going to form both the template for and the substance of positive peace.
I was a little bit, when last year when they asked me to prepare or to participate in this, I was finishing up my book on, from when I was living in Saudi Arabia, on Saudi security policy. And one of the, what I had initially was proposed to do was to talk about rehabilitation as an alternative approach to conflict resolution, in particular rehabilitation of militants. But then as we finished the book, I rolled right into, because I've been working on Myanmar, and the situation, the situation is deteriorating in the context of Myanmar, and we were talking about designing different types of peace programs, because we were worried about, because if we didn't sign the ceasefire on February 12th of this year, which was Union Day, to the elections at the end of the year, there's an increase in conflict right now, that it's potentially going to go, it's going to get a lot worse. And when more I delved into it, all that kept coming through my mind was Dr. Said's cultural approach. And so I set aside what I had initially planned to do in talking about rehabilitation of militants to talk about, or to utilize Dr. Said's cultural approach for conflict transformation and peace-building operations. And in particular, what I'm going to unveil in this paper is using Dr. Said's cultural approach to answer something that the U.S. military has said is going to be needed. And my argument is that we need that now. And what the U.S. military had argued for is that there was going to come a time in the future in which we are going to need a civilian-led framework for stability operations. Well, if anybody's familiar with stability operations, conflict transformation is one of those types of is within the realm of stability operations. Peace-building operations is separate therefrom. Well, what I have designed using Dr. Said's cultural approach is a civilian-led framework for peace-building and conflict transformation operations. And my hypothetical operational environment is Myanmar. And so, because working within ASEAN and teaching students from ASEAN, that there cannot be domestic interference in the states of others. So what I've done is, rather than proposing strategies and tactics to be implemented in the 7 ethnic states in Myanmar, I have done that conceptually, where I've talked about the strategies and tactics. Now today, I am not going to talk about the strategies and tactics, because that would be way too much. It is in the paper that I sent Kareem this morning. So what once I get this. Oh, there we go. Just sorry. I don't want to time. Yeah, so just pause it. You don't have to pause it for each one. Yeah. Okay. So with this, it's alternative methods and strategies for conflict resolution. It's the actual title is called Muallim Abdulaziz Said's Fragile Flower: Alternative Methods and Strategies for Conflict Transformation and Peace Building. Well, I've given a little bit of a background. What we'll talk about today is Dr. Said's Seeding Hands. In particular, I will outline the normative framework which I've used to provide the background for the civilian-led framework for peace building and conflict transformation operations. Then I'll talk about the research framework, because for me, in order for me to carry out this is a significant project with 7 states. We did what the CIA utilizes as cultural intelligence analysis. We utilize that. Also, the U.S. Army uses a district, what's called a district stability assessment. So I combined those two different things and modified that using with Dr. Said's framework of a cultural approach to look at each 7 ethnic states. And that was a lot to do. So I had a team. I had 21 student researchers, 3 students per team. Each of them had the guidelines for the framework and the questions for that I was using both when I combined the district stability assessment as well as the cultural intelligence analysis, which is called cultural mapping. And then we looked at all of those, all of the different 7 states. And then I aggregated that because each of my students did an individual assessment on the particular state. So, like say, for example, the 3 students that did Shan, each of them did not work together, but did their own individual assessment on the Shan state. So I aggregated that data to be able to compile what was needed in order to develop this framework. And so that is what I'm going to unveil to you today. So as I've already mentioned, this will utilize Dr. Said's cultural approach to conflict transformation and peace building to address what the U.S. Armed Forces has highlighted. It has highlighted that we would need, eventually come a time when we need a civilian-led stability operations. My argument is that Dr. Said's cultural approach is the foundation. It should be the foundation for that. And when we look in the context of Myanmar, Myanmar is an ideal environment for the employment of such types of operations, because when you put in, why would we need civilian-led operations? We need civilian-led operations, particularly in which you cannot have multinational armed forces. The region is not hospitable to having multinational armed forces inside to be able to monitor the ceasefire. And the tensions between the police and the military itself, as well as with the ethnic armies, makes it not conducive to have the security forces there. But civil society is capable of doing that. And we have different cases from around the world where civil society has monitored ceasefires, has engaged in peace building, and so forth. And so that's where this is going. So I will first start out with sort of give you a background on the normative framework, so you can see where and which this is coming from. So Dr. Said had opined in the 20th century that the 20th century was one of total war because the concept of total peace is lacking. The concept of peace, which I'm using here, entails the universal acceptance of tolerance and inclusivity, free will to choose, and thus the inherent potential to be good, moral commitment to bringing about balance and harmony in the world, compassion, and forgiveness over retribution. There must be a presence of and activities to support justice, cultural diversity, political pluralism, human dignity, human rights, and in order for peace to prevail over conflict. The path, therefore, requires the cultivating of fields, the watering of roots, and wholehearted belief in the knowledge that the seeds of peace will bloom for tomorrow's children. The cultivation of peace requires a holistic cultural approach. The cultural approach is a bottom-up alternative approach to peace building. It seeks to build long-term stability in conflict environment. It seeks to repair societal relations. It seeks to reduce social polarization and seeks to facilitate stable peace. A peacemaker must therefore understand the basic values of cultures and their corresponding behavioral expressions within the conflict environment and from the competing lenses of the actors. Their objective is to disentangle the complex multi-dimensional web of meaning, which is essential for 1, understanding the layers of actors involved, understanding the issues at hand and at play within the different social hierarchies, understanding the linkages between the actors' issues and interests, and understanding the relational variance of all the conflict's components. When looking inside Myanmar, as I've already mentioned, I had a guided research team for the ethnic states. There were 7 teams with 3 students per team. Each one of them covered one of the ethnic states. The researchers followed the guidelines that I had provided with them, and then the research it was conducted over a 4-month time period. The inferences made were temporally bounded by the end of the study, which we finished in fall of 2014. This also corresponded to another project that I was just finishing up, which was on doing a security assessment of the law enforcement, military, and intelligence sector across the ASEAN countries. Because what I will talk about today is transforming stability operations into network strategic stability operations, and in order to do that, I had to do an initial assessment of the law enforcement, military, and intelligence sector across ASEAN, because in order to have strategic network stability operations, I need to know what the security sector of my ASEAN countries can do in order to provoke such. The guiding framework, as I've already mentioned, was the District Stability Assessment Framework used by the U.S. Army. It was modified to adjust for the cultural approach. And now in the paper, once that comes out, that I have the specific the manuals for the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staffs, as well as the joint publications from the U.S. Army War College noted as to where they came from. And then I used cultural mapping and cultural intelligence, the cultural intelligence analysis framework utilized by the CIA. Okay, what is this? In a situational assessment, we look at context, cleavages, and issues and grievances. The context refers to the domestic, regional, and global environments at play for an operation. An understanding of the geographical strategic importance of the domestic actors is necessary for placing in context the societal cleavages and the issues and grievances at hand. Identification of the salient actors is also necessary to employ operations in a more strategic manner. When looking at the domestic actors within Myanmar, in order to have an assessment of their strategic importance, because when we look at how to build peace and transform conflict in each of the different states, it needs to be staggered. We can't just, because typically in conflict resolution, you go at the core. You go think of the spider web, right? You could attack the core, but the problem is conflict. Conflict web is comprised of multiple sub-conflicts, and so the approach that has traditionally been employed has been top-down, hierarchical in nature, and so the problem is you have actors who are talking at one another rather than to one another, and it's because the underlying issues and grievances at play are preventing them from actually talking to one another. And so what I'm arguing and what I've utilized is, because I'm not a Clausewitzian, I'm more of the Sun Tzu strategist here. So what I'm calling a comprehensive approach, where it's a top-down, bottom-up, inside-out, and outside-in approach. So we're strategically targeting that web, the sub-conflicts, based upon the identification of the cleavages and the issues and grievances at hand and how they impact the cleavages. Because what's going to happen is, as we start attacking that web or working at that web, what's going to happen, you're going to have instability in other areas. So you have to have employ other types of operations to be able to stabilize that environment. And so we had to be able to rank the actors. And now the downfall is because what I have not done yet is look at the regional divisions. Now I know from other research I've done, so I spent the last year and a half on Myanmar, on the regional divisions, that the same issues and grievances at play are at play in the regional divisions as they are in the ethnic states. But in order to have design better strategies and tactics, I have to also incorporate that as well. But what I utilized the framework for ranking the states was population size, land mass, ethnic states, border and regional actors, and water access and border control. So that left a ranking of 1 to 7, Shan being the most strategically important, Kachin, Rakhine, Mon, Kayan, Chin, and Kaya. Then I needed to rank, and then I needed to look at my regional actors. My regional actors, because regional actors, typically when you pull in other states to be able to help stabilize the environment, it's usually based upon allied relations with the given country, or whether it's the EU funding or a bilateral funding package for it. And the problem though is that because of the instability because of the relations between the actors. When we look at the relationship between the actors within the different states, it may serve short-term stability, but it doesn't facilitate stable peace. So it's not going after medium and long-term stability, and so the argument by ranking the different actors, and we know from playing around with in Pakistan when attempting to facilitate the dialogue with before Hakim Massoud was assassinated, when he was a similar approach was utilized by the Pakistani government at the time to sort of balance, to sort of reduce the tensions among the actors. So it's the same type of logic here that I'm employing. So ranking the regional actors who were closest geographically to Myanmar, actors who host Myanmar refugees, and actors with higher levels of foreign direct investment. That left, and I was so surprised. Now I'm based in Thailand. I did not realize how Thailand, I knew it played a significant role with the hosting of refugees, but I did not realize that it was a significant actor in all 7 states. All 7 states. There are some states that would not, at certain points in Myanmar's history, would not have survived if it was not for Thailand assisting that. So Thailand is significant. Number 2 is China. The second actor is China. Third, India, Bangladesh, Singapore, Japan, Malaysia, Laos, Brunei, and Sri Lanka. Global actors could not be ranked strategically by strategic importance, but that's reasonable because global actors need to be more fluid in nature. And when we think of the notion of strategic equilibrium, or also sometimes referred to as the equilibrium balance within the ASEAN employs. Well, with strategic balance, we can't rely too much on the EU or the United States or China or some of the other actors. It raises regional tensions as well as the tensions on the ground. It's what we found when we look at the different types of bilateral packages that have been provided over the years, not just prior to sanctions, then because even during periods of sanctions, you had different types of aid from different states that were going into the states, and then after that, to be able to look at so fluidity of the global actors. The relevant strategic actors included specifically those who host large Myanmar refugee communities, actors with foreign direct investment in the country, and/or actors who are operating within the country for the purpose of providing aid and who are involved in the peace process. As I mentioned, the list could not be ranked strategically by strategic importance. When looking at the cleavages, identification of cleavages across the states permits the imposition of the ranking by strategic importance. There are those that comprise non-arbitrary set social hierarchies and those that are arbitrary set hierarchies. The arbitrary set hierarchies across the ethnic states include socioeconomic, religious, and political cleavages. Arbitrary set hierarchies are also salient across the states when examining them individually. And the reason I raise this in terms of arbitrary set hierarchies is because that is what, when we look at cases of, a scale of stability and instability, the more arbitrary set hierarchies that you have, the greater levels of instability within the country, and within the states in particular. And the cleavages here are socioeconomic, religious, political, geographical, gender, and generational. And as you noted, socioeconomic, religious, and political are all arbitrary set cleavages. The value of the arbitrary set hierarchies is higher than that, which reinforces the assumption that there is a higher level of instability in the ethnic states, which corresponds to the report by the Director of National Intelligence with respect to Myanmar. The salient cleavages, or the salient issues and grievances across the states. Now, mind you, in the paper I have this broken down by states. Not just overall. I have each of my states broken down because one of the things that I argue, I make a longer argument in the paper, is that you have to have individual operational plan for the separate states in addition to an operational plan for Myanmar overall. And so we have to know what specific issues, but when looking at what are those issues and grievances that transcend all ethnic states, the issues are infrastructural development, land and property confiscation, sexual abuse and violence, discrimination against non-Buddhist religious communities. There's a Hindu community, Christian community, Muslim community, and an animist community. All of those religious communities are discriminated against by the majority Buddhist community, which is important because when we think of the Rakhine issue, we have a tendency to focus on the Muslim community. But one of the elements that transcend all the ethnic states is religious discrimination. The Christian community is equally discriminated against as the Muslim community. And so we do a disservice to the Muslim community when we focus specifically on the religious discrimination of the Muslim community, rather than looking at the larger picture of religious discrimination. Cultural discrimination, access in terms of the socioeconomic cleavages, the relevant issues and grievances were access to and distribution of resources, labor, migration, and illegal immigration, political and all that. And all of these allowed me then, given the reason as to why each of these are important, which I'm not going to go through. Because by identifying them, what I'm able to do is then to design, because why do the common issues and grievances across the state should be the foundation for generating awareness. And to generating awareness, you have to have an information strategy. It's also highlighting, identifying and ranking the actors based upon their strategic importance and those issues and grievances that transcend them also allow us to provide a more strategic approach to stabilizing the environment as well as to facilitating peace. And when we talk about facilitating peace, what I'm talking about here is particularly strategies and tactics for conflict transformation and peace building. Now in the paper, I went through and articulated all of that, going through my linkages and my different actors, my strategies and my tactics. The paper is fully an outline of a civilian-led framework. And generating awareness, what it is developing an information strategy. An information strategy must articulate the overall operational objectives and goals, outline the information environment and the operational environments, now mind you, the operational environments are all three levels: domestic, global, and regional. Identify the target audiences, develop the messages and construct the narratives, and articulate the types of campaigns and or operations to be employed and the means of delivery. And finally, the criteria for measurement. And as you can see, that you understand then why identifying the cleavages and the issues and grievances are important there in that context. And stabilizing the environment, what it's being articulated is the transformation of the way in which we've typically employed stability operations to network stability or network strategic stability operations, which is something actually Sergei Stepashin had given me the idea of it. Sergei Stepashin, when I was working for 2 months in the Kremlin, when Russian Dialogue with Hamas, which was sponsored by the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It was something he was talking about in terms of strategic dialogue or strategic funding of different sectors within the Palestinian Authority. So and then something that was employed in Pakistan when they were attempting to facilitate dialogue with the TTP and needing the strategic actions to be employed. And so playing with that and what has been done in the field to develop what I'm calling network strategic stability operations for the purpose of stabilizing the environment, which is why we needed to identify those specific actors. And then facilitating peace is the development of conflict transformation and peace building operations. And within each of these, I have laid down and outlined the operational objectives as well as the goals, the linkages that are needed between the actors at each of the different regional levels, and the strategies and tactics that need to be employed. But again, Myanmar is just my hypothetical operational environment. So I'm not talking about, while we talk about that in class, in the paper I'm not specifically making recommendations as to particular, although I am calling for an increase in nonviolent collective action to apply a pressure on both actors. Which then brings me to the conclusion. Since peace is a fragile flower. It must be created and cultivated and cared for and treated with care in order for it to blossom. We are the caretakers. The cultivation of peace depends on the steps taken in the pathways of life. We have to make every step count, for the future of tomorrow's generation is our independent, and the future of those in Myanmar is dependent on the actions that we take.
The great African philosopher Biavanga Wanaina lampoons many Western and Afro-pessimist writers. In Granta, this was published in 1999, and he said, they always use the word Africa or darkness or safari in their titles. Subtitles may include words like Zanzibar, Maasai, Zulu, Zambezi, Congo, Nile, big, sky, shadow, drum, sun, and bygone. Also useful are words such as gorillas, timeless, primordial, and tribal. Know that people means Africans who are not black, while the people means black Africans. Why do I begin with that? Well, interestingly, even before the great Molefi Ketiasante wrote his wonderful book Afrocentric Ideas and baptized the Afrocentric theory in 1968, insisting that we must place Africa at the center of all any discussions about African people. Mualim Said had already been doing that almost 2 decades before the great Molefi Ketiasante, who we cherish, we enjoy, we baptize as the father of Afrocentrism, wrote that. Now, why was this guy, this Syrian scholar, as they call him, writing about using concepts that were African-centered? Well, his first great book, believe it or not, many people do not know, he used to be an Africanist before he became the great guru of international relations theory and the great guru of peace and conflict resolution. But we're talking about a time when African studies had not even emerged in black universities. Strange as it may sound to many people, African studies began at American University. There used to be students from Howard University that would thank God there was a consortium that would leave Howard University and come here to take International Relations of Africa 1 and 2 with the late Professor Dara Randall, who passed away a few years ago, and then International Politics and Conflict in Africa with Said, and the great Absalom Vilakazi, the first Vice Chancellor, or first black Vice Chancellor for the university system of South Africa. Those were the only 3 people in the whole of the US that were teaching African courses. Until all these, UHNA, UCLA, Harvard, they are all Johnny-come-latelys. And to this day, even at Howard University, my great university, we don't even have a course on international relations of Africa. So that tells you the depth and breadth of people like this that started all of this phenomenon. And here is this guy writing about an African phenomenon in the 1960s when there were only 2 competing schools of thought, the conservative and the liberal. The conservative school was that, look, there's nothing good from Africa to worry about anyway. They're just coming from colonialism. You're going to have all these corrupt leaders, steal every money, bring it back to Western banks. So why bother even talking about an international relations of Africa? And they have the liberals who would say, hey, these people have been colonized for so long. You're going to expect them to have all kinds of challenges, all kinds of problems to really enjoy the fruits of their independence, so give them some time, so thereby they would excuse some of the excesses of some African leaders. But here is this guy called Abdulaziz Said bringing a very radical perspective to all of these discussions and saying that the conservatives were wrong, the liberals were wrong. What we need is a more revolutionary approach in studying and understanding the so-called phenomenon of Africa, because Africa is a phenomenal continent. So he was the first person, believe it or not, to argue about the potential of the resources on the continent, the potential of the mines that we are emerging on the continent, and the fact that when people are liberated, there is this spirit that comes with it that cannot be just dismissed as so casually. So in fact, in one of the papers I've written in the Journal of International Studies and Development in 2013, Estadio Mwalimu Abdulaziz Said's The African Phenomenon, a pluridisciplinary analysis of the fractal complexity in the early revolutionary paradigm on African politics and international affairs, I pretty much recount that. And what is strange with this guy is that he was able to finesse the negative and positive feedback loops in African thinking processes that are embedded in African cultural thought patterns. Now, how can this Syrian educated in America have all of this foresight? And hopefully we will learn about this as we move along. Why is it important to conceptualize? Of course, we all know the old Western movies about Africa. The chief gets sick, or the son of the chief gets sick. The guy comes there with his beautiful stethoscope, and bang, here's the chief. And then everybody jumps up in joy and celebration. Now the medicine man, or they call him the witch doctor, which is an oxymoron. How can you be a witch and be a doctor at the same time? That's always something that I've been having difficulty reconciling. And then he's shoved aside in the so-called euphoria of this advancement to Western medicine. And so what was missing, as we later on learned, with all these diseases that are coming up, and what we're now learning for those people who are now studying herbal medicines in the Amazons and other parts of the world, there are some secrets in this so-called witch doctor, the medicine man's bag, that in our joy for the victory over Western science, the victory of Western science over, quote, traditional healing, that we have missed a repertoire of medicines that we are now going back into a laboratory and saying that these things are much better at medicinal values than the drugs we make in the lab. So therefore, I saw this poster on the internet and I loved it. The healer version of the drug dealer. What do we have now? So then, in conceptualizing, it allows us to have precision. That is the exact name of a concept. If we talk about, for example, bacteria, then we know this is a precise concept because then it gives us the room to create a repertoire of medication that can help to fight or help to fight certain diseases. But then to call something that does not really fit because we want to project ourselves that we are the most powerful, therefore we can call things, then we have problems. For example, now we have a big challenge even in our fight against terrorism. What is terrorism? What is struggle for your own liberation? It's a wide open field. So in essence, what conceptualization allows us to do is to defeat ethnocentrism. That is, no one culture should have monopoly on what we call things, because calling things gives you a very powerful position to really dictate in terms of things that we do in the universe.